So we're going to talk about congruent polygons today, and if you consider the following quadrilaterals below, A, B, C, D, and E, F, G, H, you should notice that the sides are congruent and the angles are congruent. So when they ask about how these quadrilaterals compare, we don't just say sides are congruent, but we say corresponding sides are congruent. And not only are the corresponding sides congruent, don't forget the symbols, but you also know that the corresponding angles are congruent. Corresponding basically just means that if you were to put one quadrilateral on top of another, that they would match up perfectly. So it turns out that when shapes satisfy both these conditions, so the sides are congruent and the angles are congruent, then they are said to be congruent. So two polygons are congruent if and only if all pairs of corresponding sides are congruent and all pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. So in the picture above, quadrilateral ABCD is congruent to quadrilateral EFGH. When they ask you to list the corresponding congruent angles of the polygons, here's where you want the angle letters to match up. So you should know that the first letter, angle A, should be congruent to the first letter, angle E, and that the second letter, angle B, is going to be congruent to the second letter, which is angle F, and then angle C is congruent to G, and that angle D is congruent to angle H. So that's the corresponding piece. It's where the letters actually all match up. When they ask you to list the corresponding sides, you can look at the picture, or you can do it the same way, and you can say, well, the first two letters, side AB, has to be congruent to the first two letters, side EF. And then the second two letters, BC, have to be congruent to the second two letters, FG. And then the third and the fourth, CD, is congruent to line segment GH, and then line segment AD is congruent to line segment EH. What you need to make sure is that when you match up letters, or you must match up letters, I guess I should say, that the letters must match up. The order of the letters, it's really important that that happens. Okay, and then this should make sense when you look at the pictures, because AB happens to be marked with 4 inches, as well as EF, etc., etc. Okay, so then as we go to the next slide, let's get this up, let's get this over. So here we've got some triangles here. We've got triangle, and they're telling you that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. By knowing that, you should be able to mark the corresponding congruent parts in the diagram. The triangles are flipped, but just by looking at the letters, AB, the first two letters, has to match up with DE. And then if you look at BC, the last two letters, BC, has to match up with EF. And again, notice that you have to mark the drawing with different slashes. And then the first and third letters, vector AC, has to match up with DF. So there's the markings. In terms of the congruent angles, well, the angles, you can look at the letters in terms of the order they give it to you, or you can look at the picture and you can say, well, I know that angle A has to be congruent to angle D, because A is in between the 1 tick mark and the 3 tick mark, as is D. So these guys have to match up. And then you should also know that angle B is congruent to angle E. So this would be like 2 slashes to 2 slashes plus, by the way, second letter to second letter. And the last angles that are congruent would be angle C is congruent to angle F. When you list the corresponding sides, it's the same idea, but your letters have to match up correctly. That's really important. So for the sides, then you can say, well, I know line segment AB is going to match up to line segment DE. And line segment BC is going to match up to line segment EF, and line segment AC is going to match up to line segment DF. cannot stress enough that the letters must match up correctly. It's really important, especially in proofs. So letters must match up correctly. That's huge, okay? So if you're talking about line segment AB, letter 1 and letter 2, you can't call the other segment ED. It is the same segment, I get that, but you got to match the letters up correctly. So that's going to be really important for proofs. Here's the last one. Triangle REX is congruent to triangle FEX if you match up the corresponding parts and then you list the congruent angles and the congruent sides. Well, REX and FEX, according to the letters, RE and FE must match up. EX matches up to EX. That's the first time where you see reflexive, by the way, because if I separate the two triangles, that would be a line segment in both of them. And then RX matches up to FX. And then when we list those, and I guess we'll go to the angles first. So in the angles, we know that angle R, first letter, has to match up to angle F, first letter. Angle E is congruent to angle E. That's reflexive. We talked about that property the other day. And then you have, oh, you know what? I need to change this a little bit because at angle E, there happened to be more than one angle there. Let me get rid of that. So let's just do this real fast. We've got R to F, but now we have E to E. Well, there's three different angles at E. There's the big angle REF, and then there's the smaller angles REX and FEX. So these have to have three letters. So the angle E on the left would be angle REX. It's congruent to the angle E on the right, which is going to be angle FEX. Again, the letters have to match. And the last set of angles that are congruent will be the angles right here. And again, that's at angle X, but we need to use three letters. So if we want to call one of those angles at X EXR, then we have to call the other angle EXF. Again, the letters have to match up. In terms of the corresponding sides, then we have this guy right here, and we can say RE, the 1/ mark, is going to go from F to E. Again, the letters have to match up. It's really important. You don't want to say RE and EF. The letters have to match up. You also have line segment RX, which is going to be congruent to line segment FX. And then you have line segment EX, which is congruent to line segment EX. Once again, we keep talking about that reflexive property, and here it is. Okay, so in terms of congruent polygons, corresponding sides have to be congruent, corresponding angles have to be congruent, and I can't say this enough, the letters have to match up. That's it.